Critical Rizzi supporters, Carlo and Melotti. This is a section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. The chapter that it's located in is chapter 6. No, wait. Yes, chapter 6. Under the section Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism. The title of chapter 6 is From the Repression of the, quote, Prague Spring, end quote, to Perestroika, 1968 to 85. So yeah, critical Rizzi supporters, Carlo and Melotti. After the rediscovery of Bruno Rizzi and the publication of the critiques by Gillas and Karan Mazulevsky, the odds were that at least those parts of Rizzi's bureaucratization of the world analyzing the Soviet Union would also be republished. This did indeed happen in 1967 when a new Italian edition appeared. Footnote. At the beginning of the 1960s, Rizzi had again made himself heard in a few publications. End footnote. Approximately from that time, the Italians, Antonio Carlo, born 1941, and Umberto Melotti, born 1940, developed theories which in essential respects were consistent with Rizzi's train of thought. Antonio Carlo, at least I know, has a piece. I believe he has a piece in the book The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel Tickton and Michael Cox. Yes, that's the text. In contrast to Rizzi, the sociologist Carlo rejected the idea that the bureaucracy constituted a homogeneous and monolithic block, nor did Rizzi perceive a universal historical tendency in bureaucratic collectivism. In his 1971 treatise, The Socioeconomic Nature of the USSR, Carlo concurred with Karan and Mazulevsky's view, although he did not indicate this very clearly. Just like the latter two, Carlo perceived a connection between the industrialization process outside the capitalist world market and the emergence of a, quote, ruling class, end quote. The central thesis was that a bureaucratic collectivist society could only arise in countries where the productive forces were only at a rather low level. Admittedly, the system could also be imposed on more highly developed countries, such as the GDR, which is East Germany, and Czechoslovakia after World War II. But within a short time, this would necessarily lead to serious crises. The reason was that bureaucratic planning was effectively possible only in an underdeveloped country. As soon as the productive forces developed more and reached a level comparable to contemporary developed capitalism, then bureaucratic planning became unmanageable. Carlo claimed this had been proved early in the Soviet Union. Thus, while, in the initial phase of bureaucratic planning, the first 5-year plan, the number of factors to be taken into account was still relatively small, already during the second 5-year plan, the planners ran into difficulty because the productive forces raised by the first plan had caused an enormous expansion of data and conditions to be reckoned with. Quote, the economic structure of a poor, predominantly agricultural country can certainly not be compared to that of an advanced industrial country, even if the range of products is kept quite narrow. The simple growth of production possesses a series of problems relating to adjustment, merging and increasing the complexity of the preceding choices in the sectors of transport, maintenance, storage, and distribution, end quote. Footnote. That quote was from Carlo, and it says, this version was not accessible to me. I therefore cite from the reprint with the same title published in 1975. English translation. Page 85, English translation 55. As soon as other planning goals were realized, the total structure of the economy acquired a more complex character. Quote, it becomes clear that planners have an enormous job calculating and forecasting the direction of the economy. Even with the aid of electronic computers, their problems could not be overcome given the present rate at which the productive forces are developing, end quote. Carlo. Carlo's point was that social complexity and bureaucratic planning calculations are incompatible. Even if one supposed that the USSR was assisted by millions of highly developed computers, which was far from being the case, so that one would be able to plan every operation by each individual worker, then the implementation of such an extremely detailed plan would still be practically impossible. Quote, to the extent that such a mechanism becomes immensely complex, it would have to work as a mathematical model so large and complex that it cannot be questioned and readjusted every day. Such a system would imply a bureaucratic apparatus of immense dimensions and strength in order to follow every act of every worker, in turn implying an increase in the non-productive cost and therefore waste. Thus the main dysfunction that computers were supposed to eliminate reemerges once more, end quote. At some point, the plan would thus inevitably become a brake on the development of the productive forces. As soon as the system arrived at this point, then in theory only two possibilities remained: either a return to market-oriented production, which would solve the calculation problems, quote, automatically, end quote, or else a, quote, real, end quote, socialist economic planning. Thus the crisis of bureaucratic planning was the most important expression of the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production and bureaucratic collectivism. Other expressions were the disproportionalities between the means of production department, or the capital goods sector, and Department 2, the means of consumption department, or consumer goods sector. Previously identified by Kuron and Modzalewski, and the lower labor productivity and poor product quality, resulting from the fact that workers in the Soviet system had no direct interest in the production of high-quality goods. Quote, the Soviet workers, feeling that the factory does not belong to them, that the aims of the plan are not theirs, adopt a totally indifferent attitude, ... This workers' rejection combines with managerial decisions. Thus overly heavy tractors can be produced because the plan established the objective in terms of weight. Managers can profit if the stipulated goal is surpassed, and the proletariat sees no good reason to produce high-quality products to enlarge the bureaucracy's fortunes, ... They know that, given the need for labor power, they cannot be dismissed when there is no reserve army to replace them. Denied power, freedom, and an acceptable standard of living, they react with the lowest possible rhythm and quality of work, end quote, Antonio Carlo. In the same way as Stojanovic, among others, had argued, Carlo believed that underdeveloped countries which sought to industrialize outside of capitalist relations had an historic choice of two possibilities: socialism or bureaucratic collectivism. In particular, developments in the People's Republic of China had, in his view, made it clear that bureaucratic collectivism was not the only way out for non-industrialized countries. For the emergence of the bureaucratic collectivist structure, the primary condition was that the bureaucratic apparatus would attain independence vis-a-vis all social classes. In the Soviet Union, it had been shown just how this happened. After the Socialist Revolution of 1917 became bogged down, civil war, etc., the national bourgeoisie had insufficient power to restore its rule on the one hand, while on the other the exploited classes were not yet strong enough to give substance to a socialist perspective. Carlo, incidentally, also believes such a process of bureaucratic autonomization had occurred in Egypt. There was, in Carlo's opinion, little chance that bureaucratic collectivism would establish itself in many countries. In the first place, imperialism was less and less inclined to let matters get that far, and secondly, revolutionary movements in the Third World were becoming increasingly powerful and conscious, so that countervailing forces existed, quote, from below, end quote. What Carlo therefore really claimed here, although he did not say so explicitly, was that bureaucratic collectivism only had its chance in phases of a low level of class struggle nationally and internationally. The similarity with Trotsky's judgment about the historically brief duration of the phenomenon of socialist transition is in this respect quite remarkable. The political scientist Umberto Melotti endorsed Carlo's analysis of bureaucratic collectivism, but differed in Melotti's assessment of the conditions from which bureaucratic collectivism originated. Melotti criticized Carlo by arguing that any distinction between underdeveloped and developed countries or rich and poor countries was completely, quote, un-Marxist, end quote, unless one referred to the dominant mode of production, something which Carlo did not do. As an alternative hypothesis, Melotti proposed that, quote, in fact, as history shows, bureaucratic collectivism takes root, not in underdeveloped countries per se, but in countries already based on the Asiatic mode of production, end quote. This did not mean that, quote, Asiatic, end quote, countries could only develop in the direction of bureaucratic collectivism. The case of India showed that a transition to an underdeveloped capitalism was possible. Quote, further refining our argument, we could assert that bureaucratic collectivism is the typical form of development of countries based on the Asiatic or semi-Asiatic mode of production that have not been subjected to the capitalist mode of production as a prolonged and penetrating external influence, end quote. Carlo rejected this criticism and insisted that Russia in 1917 had been capitalist and that the Mir, or the peasant commune, had not survived the 19th century, whereas Asiatic relations in China had been only a remnant around 1925 to 27, the country being already included in imperialist competition at that time. The end.